Dawson Rider review.
Hey YouTube, Dawson Rider here. Welcome to my review for the Power Rangers Nano Metal Figures set. I know you've probably never heard of it because I hadn't either. This is an interesting new set that just popped up for me a month ago. I saw the pre-orders go up a month ago. It's an interesting little minifigure set including die-cast metal minifigures from a lot of MMPR, as you can see, including heroes and villains, but also from other seasons as well. It's kind of funny because I also recently covered the world's smallest Power Rangers figures, and both of these releases remind me of the sort of old school Micro Machine Power Rangers releases, which I also recently covered in retro reviews, so it's kind of interesting to see these types of things get released again. But let's go ahead and take a look at them. We'll start quickly with the MMPRs. So we got MMPR red here, and you can see it's like metallic, because it's like the die-cast metallic gimmick, which is there for all of them, but it really works in favor of the MMPR Rangers because they did have the metallic armor, and I would say these guys are decently detailed. They're not absolutely the best given the size, you know, and they're not like super pricey, so they're not super detailed, where they have like every little detail is correct in every proportion, but I'd say for what they are, they're pretty solid, and I'm not really mad at them. They do a pretty decent job at them, and they all have these little platforms, again, kind of like some of those old school 90s releases. You got MMPR Blue here, whose helmet style is honestly a little bit more reminiscent of the movie one because it's that little bit more slender, whereas like the main show one, the G-Ranger suit, is a little bit more of a fat helmet. Yellow here I think is one of the weirdest looking because you can see its helmet's a little bit more rounded than it should be, like because it's got those little points on the top, so it definitely looks more reminiscent of those sort of 90s figures. Pink kind of has the same problem with a little bit too wide of bug eyes for the proportions, but still it's kind of decent. MMPR Black I think looks pretty solid. I actually think they did a pretty impressive job considering like you have those finer little details of the tusks and stuff, and usually in small figures like this I've seen them really botch the tusks and like look like they were trying to put a model kit sticker on and they put it up on the forehead. So pretty solid there in my opinion. Then you have Green here, whose Dragon Dagger is silver for some reason, and he's doing a I need to use the facilities in the woods pose. I don't know, but the colors look pretty good. Metallic looks actually really nice on green. I kind of dig it. Then you have MMPR White, which is not metallic, but it's just a classic white, and I think it looks pretty good too. I think they did a pretty good job on the details and the proportions. Again, on this one it's kind of in particular impressive because there is some little finer details they could have easily botched. He lost Saba on an unfortunate schmelting accident. You also get Draken, which is the only one in here from the comics. I mean, obviously the MMPR Rangers are from the comics, but an exclusive comic ranger, and also the only one to have a gold-plated platform here, and I think he looks pretty nice. I dig it. He's got an inaccurate Saba because it doesn't have the missing head, although I guess he did have it for a little bit without the missing head, but that would have been a cool little detail to add. Now moving on to other series, we have Gold Zeo, which I think also looks pretty good. It would have been kind of cool to have a little bit more of a metallic flair to him, but still, I think he looks pretty solid. I feel like he could have been the only other one. Oh, I guess Goldhar and Scorpina have gold-plated ones, but I mean in terms of the Rangers, I wish he would have had the gold-plated bottom as well. Then Zeo Ranger 4 Green, which don't get me wrong, I like Adam, but I think it's just weird. Like, I'm really surprised they didn't go for red, but I'm kind of happy that they went for a non-red color for this. And I think he looks pretty cool with the metallic finish look, and I think they did a pretty good job on the details. Like, you can even see the little indents from Zeo's helmet, and like that very easily could have looked weird with just the square and the round helmet. Then you have a lone Psycho Ranger, Psycho Red, which looks pretty okay, I have to say. Honestly, given the way that their heads are a little bit weirdly shaped, they did a pretty solid job on it. Then you have Ninja here, which I think is a pretty solid addition. A really nice bright blue, which I really like. I think he looks pretty neat. And Ninja is a pretty rare character to get a figure of recently, so I think that's kind of a neat addition. Now we have some of my favorite additions. You have Korag the Nightwolf here, which is pretty good. I do like it just because I like Korag and I like the purple color. I do have to say the head sculpt isn't the best. I think they could have done a better job. Like, even at its small size, it's kind of noticeable. But the thing that I was possibly most excited about was this Wolf Warrior figure. Again, it carries over not being perfect, but we never got a proper figure release of this here in the US. I believe they did a special set in the UK, but as of this recording, we haven't gotten a figure release for this. I'm hoping for a Lightning Collection one day. Probably something that will be an exclusive, but I love this suit design. I'm glad to finally have something from it, kind of like with the Hyperforce figures. Even though they're only unpainted figures from the board game, I get excited to have figures of things in some form we've never gotten before. I wish it was a different pose, but I understand it saves money just to use the same mold as Korag. But it's still pretty cool. Not perfect, and unfortunately I think it is one of the more imperfect designs, but I think his visor actually looks a little bit better than Korag's. I think that the shape stands out a little bit more. Another neat addition here is Phantom Ranger, another figure, or another character, excuse me, that we don't get very many figures of. In fact, I think we only really have maybe 2, like the official release, and I think there was some sort of special like toothbrush set or something weird, I don't know. But point is, not a lot of figures for this guy, and I think this looks pretty cool. He also has a blaster, which I don't recall him using in the series, but it's been a while. But still, we don't have a lot of figures of him. He's a fan favorite, you know, and he was much more of a slightly more minor character in the Sentai, which is why we don't have a ton on him. Now getting into villains, you have Lord Zed here, which looks fine. I'm going to be honest, I'm not too into the villain figures, not because they're not done well, but I was digging the Ranger figures so much, I honestly would have much rather had 4 more Ranger figures than the villains. Rita's here as well. Again, she looks fine. She's one of the only ones with a human face, which looks not bad for what it is, but again, I'm not too thrilled with the villain figures. Then you have Goldar here, which is the wingless version, which is presumably to save space, but the gold looks pretty decent on him, and he's not a bad representation of the character. And lastly, you have Scorpina from both Mighty Morphin and Hyperforce, who also doesn't look half bad, and I'm actually kind of mildly impressed with how decently the faces are done on Rita and her. Not that they're like amazing, but again, given the small details, this is something I've seen really messed up in previous types of figure releases, but again, I'm not too into the villain figures. You might be, it's just a personal preference. I would have liked to seen 4 more unique Rangers rather than villains, and then maybe do like a separate villain set. Like, that's what I would have done. A few more extra Rangers, and then maybe do a separate villain set and even include some Psychos in there. But yeah, I honestly think this is a neat figure set. Certainly not on my top absolute recommend list, but I think if you're into things like this, I think it's worth a look. I like little niche collector's items like this, and I think it's neat that you have a decent handful of rarely released or figures that aren't even released at all in this, and I think that's kind of neat. And I appreciate that this set wasn't only MMPR, and not only was it not only MMPR, but the figures included are more obscure Ranger characters that aren't released very often. So anyway, that's about it for this one, guys. Until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell so you get notifications for my videos. Dawson Rider, signing out.